Welcome back, guys. In today's video we are going to try to rebuild a rather sickly spider plant. And we got this plant from a friend of ours. She had two of them. They're identical, same pot, same plant, same situation. They were both pretty stressed, and she actually gave them to my wife and said, hey, maybe your husband can do something with these because they're not looking so hot. And my wife brought them home. I took a look, and it didn't take me too long to realize what was going on with these guys. Predominantly, the problem with these plants is that they are infested with scale. And I figured this would be a perfect opportunity to kind of do a deep dive into scale insects and how they work, because they are a very unique insect in the way that they go through their life generations. And they can be tricky to deal with, and if you don't understand their life cycle, they can be darn near impossible to deal with. So understanding how they work and what they do is really important in trying to effectively control them. So here's the deal. Scale insects are, like I said, they're really unique. They have this generational thing that they go through in order to reach maturity, and we're going to start with what we call the adult female, because that's usually what you'll see on a plant. And I've got some here, and I don't know if the camera is going to pick these up, but usually the adult female will look something like this, and I don't know if the camera will pick it up or not, but it's those little brown bumps on there, and you can wipe them off with your finger. And that's the stage of development that usually you'll actually see on a plant, and that'll kind of let you know that you've got scale. Now what that bump is that is an adult female scale insect that has gotten onto a plant part, and over time it has created a waxy shell, a coating over the top of it, which protects that female. And while she's under that shell, she's got her little mouth parts inside the plant, and she's sucking the sugars and carbohydrates out of that plant. Okay, and while she's underneath that shell, she's going to lay eggs, and then eventually those eggs will hatch. And when those eggs hatch out, they will be what we call the crawler stage. Crawler stage are these very small insects. Typically you're going to need magnification to see them. And these little crawler stages or insects are going to be crawling around on the plant, and then they're going to find a spot on that plant that they like, and they're going to settle down on that spot. And then they're going to create a waxy shell over them and become an adult female, and then they will eventually lay eggs, and the cycle continues. Scale insects are what we call parthenogenetic. They don't actually need a male to reproduce. They can go through that whole life cycle on their own and impregnate themselves, if you would, to create new eggs on their own. There are some males. There will be some males crawling around, you know, here and there, in and amongst the females. But the females don't even necessarily need the males in order to reproduce. Now, this is really important to understand that, because when they are in their scale stage, the adult female with that scale covering, and when they're in their egg stage, they are very difficult to control through any kinds of spray means. Okay, spraying like pesticides, like you could use an actual insecticide. A much more organic, more benign approach would be things like insecticidal soaps or horticultural oils. Regardless, those things are going to be almost useless against the adult female and against the egg. The only thing that's going to really be effective against is the crawler stage. Okay, now this is really important to understand this for two reasons. If you're dealing with scale outdoors, okay, like let's say your outdoor ornamental plants, they can get scale, right? Up here in Connecticut we deal with like lilac scale, white prunicola scale, and holly scale, magnolia scale, hemlock scale is a classic. Each one of these different types of scale are going to have a different timeline as to when they're going to go into their crawler stage. See, when they're outside, especially if you're in a colder environment where you actually experience a winter, where you get temperatures below freezing through January and February, a lot of these scale insects will only have one or maybe two of these life cycles per growing season. And so if you want to try to deal with them effectively, you have to know when they're going to be in that crawler stage so that you can spray them with some insecticidal soap or horticultural oil or an insecticide or whatever. For example, white Pruning scale here in Connecticut usually goes into its crawler stage through the month of June. Okay, the cottony taxus scale, which we find on taxus and rhododendrons and hollies, they usually go into their crawler stage in July. Magnolia scale goes into its crawler stage in September. So it's kind of good to know these things, because if you're spraying for, let's say you're spraying for a Pruning scale and it goes into its crawler stage in June, well, if you see it in July and you're out there spraying in July, you're not going to do anything. It's not going to have any real effect on anything, because all you're going to have is the adult female stage and maybe a few eggs, you know, underneath that shell. The sprays are just going to wash off of it. They're not going to do anything. So it's really, so in that respect, in an outdoor respect, understanding the life cycle and how all that works can really, it can make or break your spray, whether it's going to work or not. And if you're spraying at the wrong time of year, you're just kind of wasting money, wasting time. You're putting pesticides into the environment unnecessarily, etc., etc. So that's part of the reason why that's really important. Now we're dealing with a spider plant. This is an indoor plant. This plant is not going to be affected by the environment because it's indoors. It's always going to be room temperature. It's always going to be nice and cozy in here. So in a situation like this, and you find this in greenhouses too, same basic idea, they're going to have multiple generations of all different life stages constantly, okay? Because they're just constantly reproducing. They don't have this very specific time frame and then they go dormant in, you know, through the colder months of the year, and then they wake up in the spring and go through a generation. These guys are just doing this over and over and over and over again. So in a houseplant situation, the only way you're going to really effectively control this kind of a thing is through persistence, okay? Because you can come in here and do all the stuff you want to do, and you can spray them with, like, say, insecticidal soap, right? Because that's a nice, safe product to use. And if you spray them, you might get really good control of your crawlers. But 2 weeks later, you're going to have a set of eggs coming up right behind them, and those eggs are still going to hatch out, you know? And so all of a sudden, you know, let's say a month or so down the road, you go, oh, I'm infected again. My tree's infected. It looks so good, and now all of a sudden it's infested again. That's because you weren't persistent enough. That spray of horticultural oil or insecticidal soap or whatever you choose to use, you know, it may have knocked out the crawlers, but it had very little impact on the eggs or the adult females that are getting ready to continue to lay eggs. So really the trick is to be persistent. Now in a situation like this plant is pretty rough. I mean, there's a lot of dead, I'm just gonna kind of, okay, these are all just dead leaves. There's a lot of yellowing. There's a ton of scale in here on these branches. It's just all over. It seems like they're mostly on the little shoots here, the little flowering shoots that have the babies on them. I mean, this is just, I'm sure the camera probably is not picking this up, but this is just covered with scale. Okay, so this guy's in really rough shape. So in a situation like this, the first thing, and I always talk about this whenever you're dealing with any kind of insect or disease issue, the first thing we're going to do, like, we're going to beat this plant up a little bit. We got to deal with this. And cultural controls to start with is going to be the best way to go about getting this ball rolling. So we're going to come through and we're going to prune out all these really heavily infested stems. There are some on the leaves. This leaf right here has got a few on there. If I see heavily infested leaves, I'm going to prune those leaves out. Some of these scales, you can just scrape them off with your thumbnail. So let's go ahead and get started with the cultural controls, with the removal of all the nasty stuff, and just clean this thing up and see where we're at. There's something I just enjoy about rebuilding plants. I think it's the process of observation and diagnosing the problems and coming up with a plan and working on them. It's just something I really enjoy doing. You may have noticed that I haven't mentioned anything about fertilizing these plants yet, and there's a reason for that. Most of the time, if you're dealing with an insect issue on your plants, if you fertilize the plants, you're actually kind of inadvertently feeding the insects, because these insects are feeding on the sugars and carbohydrates that the plant is producing. They're actually feeding the insects, and there are some studies that have shown that it can actually increase the activity of the insects, their reproductive rate, etc. So in a situation like this, typically I won't fertilize the plants until I'm pretty confident that I've gotten substantial control of the insect problem. So we deal with the problem first, we take care of the insects, we take care of any other issues that are going on, then we start rebuilding the plant, then we start fertilizing, then we start working on making the plant really healthy again. Alright, so we went through and we did the physical removal. And you can see, I cut quite a bit out of this plant. There was a lot of heavily infected leaves and stalks that we took out. By stalks, I mean the little shoots that have the typical baby spider plants on them. Those stalks were really heavily loaded with those scale. They really like those things for some reason. But I mean, already the plant just looks more healthy, more vigorous, right? You got rid of all the garbage, a lot of the old dead dying leaves that were in there that were turning yellow, that I'm sure were not very productive, not photosynthesizing very well. Any leaves that I found that had quite a bit of scale on them, I removed those as well. And another thing that I did is I thinned it out substantially. We can actually see right inside this plant now. And what we have is, it's the same thing as the other one. Like I said, there were two of these, they were identical. It's basically a big pot with about 5 or 6 baby spider plants that were planted in there all at once. Okay, and the reason I wanted to really thin this out, because I wanted to clean all the debris off of the top of the soil. There were a lot of dead leaves and little stalks and pieces of organic matter. You want to get all that stuff out of there, because I'm going to be spraying this plant with insecticidal soap. Insecticidal soap is very benign. It's basically soap, and so it's very safe. And I don't ever use pesticides inside my house. My wife would never allow that. But soap is very benign. And even still, I'm actually going to take this up to the 3rd floor. I've got an extra room up there where I sometimes use for like plant isolation. I can do some stuff up there with it. But so part of the reason why I thinned this guy out so much was because insecticidal soap is strictly a contact insecticide. It has to literally hit that crawler in order to kill it. It's not like some of these residual pesticides or insecticides that when they get on the leaf, they can actually be effective for weeks on end. All the insect has to do is walk across the pesticide and it can literally pick it up and kill the insect. Insecticidal soap is contact. It has to hit the insect. By thinning this guy out tremendously, because I know there's still tons, there's got to be tons of crawlers in here, there's still tons of eggs in here, I'm sure, I just can't see them. But by opening it up, I can get in there with my spray, and I can spray much more thoroughly and much more effectively to make sure I get good coverage on the plant, try to eliminate as many of those crawlers as I can. Now that I've done this hard physical removal, the next step is we're just going to take this thing over to the sink and we're going to give it a good shower, hit it with water. Okay, a lot of times, A, I'm going to be watering the plant, but B, I'm also going to be, a lot of times these crawlers, because they're so small, just a good shot of water, you can physically just wash them off of your plant. It'd be like the equivalent of us getting hit with a fire hose, So that's going to be the next step. We're going to take this over to the sink and we're going to give it a good drenching and a hosing down, try to physically remove as many of these things as we can. Then we're going to think about getting it upstairs and getting it set up so we can do an actual insecticidal soap spray application on it. Alright, so we are up here on the 3rd floor of my house. This is just a spare room. And I'm keeping these guys up here more or less in isolation, because I do have a couple of spider plants downstairs and I don't want them getting infested with these scale insects. So until I feel these guys have a clean bill of health, we're just going to kind of keep them up here and while we're taking care of them. And so like I said earlier, there were 2 of these plants and they were identical. I mean, they had identical pots, identical plants. They were both in distress and they were both heavily infested with scale. The one on the left over here, that's the one that we just did last night. That's the one you guys just watched me clean up. And the one over here is the one that I did about 3 or 3.5 weeks ago. And you can see the difference. I mean, from a distance, you can see that the one on the right is looking a little more healthy. It's a little more turgid. The leaves are a little more upright. You know, it just looks a little bit happier. The one on the left is still very wilty. It's definitely under a lot of stress, and but we're gonna start that process of getting these guys back in shape again and healthy. So here's the one from a couple, 3-4 weeks ago that I started working on, and here's the one that we just started last night. All right, so I took these guys down off the stools because I don't feel like getting insecticidal soap on those wooden stools. I just put them down here. I got an old moving blanket I put down this way. Anything that drips off or anything will get on the blanket. It won't get on the carpet. And I just use these almost like rags. I don't care. So what we have is insecticidal soap. I'm using the Safer brand. Label calls for 2.5 ounces per gallon. And we're going to spray these guys up. The idea is you want to get really good coverage, because insecticidal soap, like I said before, is a contact insecticide. So it literally has to hit the insect in order to control it. It's not going to have a long residual. It's not going to hang out on the plant and work down the road. So good coverage is really important. So that's what we're going to do now, is just get these guys sprayed up. Try to get the undersides a little bit. You want to get down in the crowns. A lot of times these scales will hang out down in the crown of the plant where all the leaves come out. So you definitely want to get some good coverage down there. I'm going to be doing probably 3 or 4 applications of this stuff, and I'm probably going to run this stuff at about a 12-day interval, something like that. In between sprays, I'll bring them downstairs and I'll wash them off again in the sink. Again, that physical control, you can try to knock some of those crawlers off in between sprays. So we'll do that, and we'll keep them watered. And then once I'm pretty confident, probably after the 3rd spray, I'll be pretty confident that we've got good control. And at that point, I'll start thinking about really rebuilding these plants, right? Thinking about fertilizing and getting them back downstairs where it's a little bit warm, where they'll get a little bit more sunlight, and we'll start fertilizing them. Well, I hope this video was helpful, and thanks for watching. We'll see you guys soon.